All right, welcome to Sunday School, and we are picking up today with the Jacob narrative. If you remember, he had just tricked his father out of the blessing after tricking his brother out of the birthright, and now he's going to have to go on the lam for a while. So for somebody like me who studies tricksters, this is the best part, right? So now we get Jacob in all his glory. And it's really interesting because there are aspects of this Jacob story which are so fascinating when you study trickster stories. So when I was doing my dissertation, I read all kinds of trickster stories in all kinds of cultures. And it was fascinating the kind of overlap that you would see from different times, different historical periods, different cultures. That trickster stories just have a certain kind of certain patterns, certain themes that run through them. And I looked at everything from African-American trickster stories, which go from slave tales to Reconstructionist stories to all kinds of accounts of how African-Americans have struggled in white American society, but how the stories of tricksters can create like release valve, like it lets the pressure off. It can be coded language about how in the end we'll triumph. I read Winnebago Native American trickster stories, which has a real trickster tradition, often represented in coyote, and looked at a lot of those. Ancient Near Eastern ones, Enki of the Sumerians, who's Ea in Akkadian literature. And it's just fascinating that you find a lot of these parallels. One of the things you see in tricksters, and I bring this up because we're going to see it today, tricksters, again, tend to break boundaries. They end up on margins. They're hard to categorize. Sometimes in stories, you see this, I don't even know how to describe it. They're sometimes hard to categorize as far as gender goes. While they trick, they're often tricked as well. That's a common thread throughout trickster stories. It's how tricksters at some level in stories get duped. They often get led astray or tricked either gastronomically or sexually, which is going to be interesting because that sounds like, wait, what are we talking about? But we're going to see some things happen in the Jacob story where you're going to go, wait, what just happened there? These tricksters cross boundaries and turn things on their head, but in turning them on their head, they often make order or often bring salvation. Some scholars, and I talked about this a fair bit in my own work, is about how tricksters break taboos, they break boundaries, but in doing that, it's in order to bring order or salvation to peoples, not to say, therefore, no one has to follow the rules. Right? So sometimes people have not seen tricking and deceiving in the biblical story because they feel like, well, if the heroes trick, well, then maybe that's saying it's okay for all of us to trick and lie and deceive. And that's not how trickster stories work. They realize there's these certain individuals, certain categories who break the rules, not to make it possible for all of us to break the rules, but somehow their breaking the rules brings wholeness to everyone else. And that sounds really bizarre, but let me give you an example of it on a different, in a different category. Think about ancient Near Eastern priests, okay? So the priest is the holiest person. They're the ones who bridge humans in God. And one of the things in ancient Israelite culture, one of the greatest taboos is around blood, right? You can't touch blood. You can't eat blood, right? Blood is something that defiles. But if you look at the religious rites of the priests use the blood as a way to make what's for the regular person defiling and taboo, they use the blood in order to do the most holy things. Think about the sacrifices. Think about how the priests in Leviticus are like sprinkling blood on all kinds of things. Think about how they're pouring, the blood being let out on altars. So there's this use of blood doesn't mean the priest says, therefore, hey, everybody go at it, eat your steaks rare, slaughter how you want, blood's, good to go. Somehow in the priest using it, it brings wholeness, but it somehow shows even more clearly the taboo against blood for regular folk versus the way the holy person uses it. Think about the flip side of the coin on a mythic level, the way tricksters function like a priest. They're breaking boundaries, they're deceiving, they're breaking the normal rules of society in a way that brings order, but not making it so it's kosher for anybody to do that, okay? So as we look at his Jacob story, we're gonna see where he tricks, and we've seen him tricking, but we're gonna see some stories also where he gets duped, all right? So with that as a little backdrop, let me share my screen and we'll look at the text here. All right, can people see the text? All right. Let me back up one chapter. We're up to chapter 28. So remember, Rebecca heard Esau say, as soon as dad dies, I'm going to kill him. So she talks and says, hey, he should go somewhere else to find a spouse. So 28 picks up with that. When Isaac called Jacob and blessed him, he charged him, you shall not marry one of the Canaanite women. Go at once to Padan Aram, to the house of Bethuel, your mother's father, and take as wife from there one of the daughters of Laban, your mother's brother. May God Almighty bless you and make you fruitful and numerous, that you may become a company of peoples. May he give to you the blessing of Abraham to you and to your offspring with you, so that you may take possession of the land where you now live as an alien, land that God gave to Abraham. Let me just pause there. Notice all the elements. He's talking about him having blessing. He's talking about being fruitful and numerous, becoming a nation. And he talks about him possessing the land, right? This is right back to Genesis 12, promise to Abraham. We then hear it's passed on to Isaac. Isaac is now passing this on to Jacob. Thus Isaac sent Jacob away, and he went to Padan Aram to Laban, son of Bethuel the Aramean, the brother of Rebekah, Jacob and Esau's mother. So he's heading up into what would now be modern day Syria. And we get a little aside here from the main line of the story because we got to check in on Esau. Now Esau saw that Isaac had blessed Jacob and sent him away to Padan Aram to take a wife from there. And that as he blessed him, he charged him, you shall not marry one of the Canaanite women. And that Jacob had obeyed his father and his mother and gone to Padan Aram. So when Esau saw that the Canaanite women did not please his father Isaac, Esau went to Ishmael and took Mahalat, daughter of Abraham's son Ishmael, and sister of Nebaioth, to be his wife in addition to the wives he had. Which is really interesting because he gets like, hey, we're not supposed to marry the people of the land. We're supposed to marry within the tribe, right? Within the clan. But in doing that, it's like he doesn't quite get it. He marries within the line of Abraham, but not within the line that we're going to see the chosen line moves through this account. But it's Esau trying to figure out, just wait, okay, so not Canaanites, so he goes to the Ishmaelites. But we've already seen the quote unquote blessing of the Ishmaelites, right? That they're going to be separate and a problem, and they're going to be like the wild donkey out in the wilderness. But Esau says, what the heck? I'll make my bed with them. Figuratively and literally, I guess. All right, so Jacob is on the move. And again, remember what I said about tricksters crossing boundaries. These trickster stories, remember the wife-sister narratives, Every one of these are when the patriarch leaves home. They're on a journey and they're outside the land. They're marginalized. They're in this liminal space. And Jacob, again, as the trickster par excellence, he's going to be tricking everywhere he goes, home and abroad. But he's now on the move, and an interesting thing's going to happen. Jacob left Beersheba and went toward Haran. He came to a certain place and stayed there for the night because the sun had set. And it's interesting, we're going to get two really key stories, going and coming back, which are going to happen after the sun sets. Again, this idea of crossing boundaries from ordered space to the margins is really important. And we have these kind of traditions even in our own cultures, like crossing thresholds, or you think in African-American tradition, right? The jumping over the broom. There's this idea when you cross a boundary, and we're going to have as Jacob's getting ready to cross a boundary, leaving a really key moment of experience, connecting to the divine, and we're going to see the same thing when he's coming home. Okay, so think about this as this three-part journey: the at home, the in the outside space, and then on the way back. Right, so it's three parts. So he's on his way out. He came to a certain place. It's night. The sun had set. Taking one of the stones of the place, he put it under his head and lay down in that place. And he dreamed that there was a ladder set up on the earth, the top of it reaching to heaven, and the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. And the Lord, notice all caps, and Yahweh stood beside him and said, I am Yahweh, the God of Abraham, your father, and the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie, I will give to you and your offspring. And your offspring shall be like the dust of the earth, and you shall spread abroad to the west and to the east and to the north and to the south. And all the families of the earth shall be blessed in you and in your offspring. Know that I am with you and will keep you wherever you go, and will bring you back to this land. For I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. Okay, big deal on lots of levels. One, he's in a space where he has this vision of angels ascending and descending on a ladder, right? Like there's a link here between earth and heaven. This is a big deal. C.S. Lewis has this great line where he talks about holy places, and he calls them thin places. These places where our normal, everyday, earthly realm and the heavenly realm, the divide between them is very thin. And people in those places experience something, and they get this sense that there's something divine in this space, holy space. And he experiences that. Then Yahweh appears, and now not just Isaac, but Yahweh reaffirms the promise. He's going to bless the whole world through him. He's going to make him numerous. He's going to be with him. He's going to be with him wherever he goes. And again, let me just say this. This, sadly, is Christian cliche that God is with us everywhere, right? Like we hear that from the time we're little kids, so it kind of rolls off us like nothing. In the ancient Near Eastern world, gods were like kings, goddesses were like queens, and you have territory. When you leave your territory, it was as if you are leaving the authority and power of your deity, and now you will be under the auspices of the deities into the land in which you're going, right? If I go travel to Mexico and I break the law, I can't say, hey, it doesn't really matter down here because I'm an American. I'm under the authority of Mexico. And if the US wants to do something about that, because I'm me, they wouldn't. They'd be like, rot in the prison down there. There's all kinds of high-level negotiations to figure that out because I'm under Mexican authority. In the ancient world, that's the same way they saw deities. So there are a few times in Genesis where this really powerful thing is said, where Yahweh says, Don't be afraid. Wherever you go, I'm going with you. That's like taking your king along on your travels. That is radical theology for their day. But again, we hear it and we're like, well, yeah, of course, God's everywhere. Isn't that great? This is a big deal. Wherever you go, I'm still there with you. So when you leave, when you cross this boundary, don't see it like I'm on my own now. I will still be with you. Okay? And again, Jacob, verse 17, wakes up. He was afraid, right? Always afraid when you think you just saw God. People can't see God and live. That's the mantra. Now, everywhere in the Bible they see God, they always live, which is really kind of, I love that. But the conventional wisdom is God's too holy and awesome. You can't see him and live. So he just saw him in his dream. He's like, he's scared. How awesome is this place? And here's the line I love. This is none other than the house of God. Betuel, or Bethel is the English. And this is the gate of heaven. Now, I'm asking you to jump back in your head to the Bab Elu, gate of heaven or gate of the gods, literally gate of the gods. Babylon called itself gate of the gods because they're the ziggurat. They saw it as the way that the divine beings went up and down. Now in this Israelite holy place of Bethel, Jacob sees a ladder. He sees divine beings go up and down. Yahweh speaks to him there. He realizes it is holy. And he says, this is the Bab Elu. This is the gate of the gods. This is the gate of heaven. Not Babylon. Remember, the story of the Tower of Babel redefined it. It's not the land of the gate of God. It's the land of confusion. It was not Bab Elu, it's Balal, confusion. This is, again, it's like political parody and in explaining a holy site in Israel. Why is it called Bethel? Why is it called House of God? Because here's where Jacob, our forefather, saw the angels going up and down. All right, does that make sense? You see how it echoes of that story we had earlier and said, he just undermined the place they called Gate of the Gods in their world. And now he follows it up like, oh yeah, I'll tell you the real gate of heaven. It's right here, right? We got it right down the street. It's in Bethel. So Jacob rose early in the morning. He took the stone that he had under his head, right? He's going to have a holy stone here, a stela. It just so happened to have been his pillow the night before. And he set it up for a pillar and poured oil on the top of it. He called the place Bet El, or Bethel. And Bethel, again, means house of God, because that's what he said. Holy cow, this is the house of God. But the name of the city was Luz at that time. So he renames it, which says probably in the time of the Israelite, this place had two different names and people remembered it a certain way. And it says, here's why we call it Bethel. Now, here's where I feel like we get to see the true Jacob, right? He just had this existential moment, this epiphany of seeing Yahweh, who makes this promise, says all this great stuff to him. Right? And when we think of those moments and we hear people's testimonies, and right, this is when they just break down and they like, I'll give you everything. And God, whatever you ask of me, like this is what we expect. But Jacob's the trickster, and the tricksters are wily. He's not just laying down for this God. Here's what he says. If God will be with me and will keep me in this way that I go, and will give me bread to eat and clothing to wear, so that I come again to my father's house in peace, then Yahweh shall be my God. And this stone, which I set up for a pillar, shall be God's house. And of all that you give me, I will surely give 1/10 to you. He doesn't lay down. He says, put your money where your mouth is. Let me see how you do over these next few years. And if you come through, great, then you're my God. Until that point, let's just kind of hang it out there and we'll see for sure, right? Like this is bold. Jacob is continually wheeling and dealing. Even with Yahweh, he doesn't say, well, God, whatever you call me to do, right? These are the great moments where everyone gives their great little God speech and your humble servant bows down before you. He's not bowing down. He's just like, this is awesome. All right, God, let's make a deal. Stick by me, and when we all come back, you'll have the pleasure of me claiming you as my God. Welcome to Jacob. All right. Comments or questions about this story? Is this a new story for people, or is this a story that you're familiar with? Or maybe familiar with, just not the way I told it.
Well, yeah, the facts are familiar, but this is certainly a new slant.
Yeah. See, this is the beauty of reading scripture as a whole, because when we read it in small swaths out of its context of overall character development, you could read this and take it really pretty pious. But when you see Jacob for who he is and what he does, you're like, oh no, he's trying to get the upper hand here. I've done a chapel talk with students in the past where I have them at the very beginning. I ask them, like, I tell them to stand up, because we're in the theater space, and I stand up if you feel like you are talented at like math. If you feel like you've just been gifted in math, and like you get a smattering of people stand up, and then I ask them, like, stand up if you feel like you just have this gift or natural affinity to literature and poetry. If you're a words person, right? And you get a few people stand up, and then this is great in American. I ask them, stand up if you feel like you have a talent or a natural bent and affinity towards athletics, and like 90% of them stand up, right? Like they're all like superstar athletes in their minds. I go through these things, and then I ask them the question that they've never been asked. I said, stand up if you think you have a natural bent or affinity or talent or giftedness around spirituality. And then they're looking at each other like, I think we're all supposed to stand up, but I don't know if that applies to me, right? Because we forget that there is a certain kind of gift, talent, wiring that some people get spirituality and it just comes naturally, and other people, it doesn't come naturally. It's like a struggle. I don't automatically get moved in the same ways or make the connections in the same ways. And I hold up Jacob as a guy who, even though he's the religious hero, I don't think he had the natural bent. I think even in this, he sees that there's an angle. And we talk through that, that's okay. God still works with us, whether faith and spirituality come naturally or not. Jacob, and we're going to see more and more throughout his life, it doesn't come naturally, but that doesn't stop God from using him. And in fact, using him more than anybody else. So I love this story. It's when it's read in its context of the whole narrative, it turns a lot of stuff on its head. And it's not just about naming how Bethel got its name. All right, any other questions or comments?
I got a comment. It seems like maybe part of this is human nature, because how many times have we gotten into a predicament and we pray to God, if you do this, I'll do this. Yep. I guess you call it, these days, it's always referred to as a quid pro quo. Yeah. This for that, right? Yeah. So I don't know what George Jacobs' skill was, but it sounded like it might be business. Yeah. Even though he's in a religious book, he's known for that. Yeah. Maybe his real gift was something else. He can turn something into nothing, right? I mean, nothing into something.
Get ready, because he's going to do more of that. That's for sure.
Yeah. I think that's his gift, is the business world.
Yeah.
Not that that's dishonest, but somehow guys like that always come out on top financially.
Yeah. And again, each of the patriarchs, every time they deceive in trick, they see their status rise and they grow in wealth and stature. Again, that's about a trickster. That's not about the moral of the story is therefore trick, deceive, and lie. The same way the priest isn't teaching us, hey, go in the backyard and do whatever you want with blood. It's in these unique characters, they're breaking these boundaries that bring us a different kind of order, creation, and salvation.
Should we have a new understanding of the song, We Are Climbing Jacob's Ladder?
Yeah, I've always wondered about that. That's another class I'd like to do, is all these like Bible songs, spiritual worship songs that use Bible verses in context that I have no idea what they actually mean. Like sing judgment on us and we're singing it along like, hey, isn't this happy? I've never quite gotten that one, other than I guess like we're heading up to heaven with the angels, but no one in that story goes up his ladder, up and down. It seems presumptuous that we jump on the ladder.
That's typically American.
That's right. That's right.
Well, I think it is. It's a spiritual, and maybe it came. The ladder is mentioned. It doesn't talk about so much people going up and down, but if you're a slave, an American slave, and you think, wow, this might apply to me. I'm on this ladder getting out of my predicament here on earth, going to somewhere better. I think that's what that song's about.
Right. And it, you have the same imagery in Swing Low, Sweet Chariot, right? You get these pictures of people where God's chariot comes down and rescues.
Right.
It's kind of expanding that imagery to the Jacob story. That's not necessarily what the Jacob story is trying to show, but you're right. I think that is the parallel. All right, so Jacob is going to arrive at his destination. So we'll move on to chapter 29. And again, we're going to see some familiar themes.
Oh, could I ask a question?
Yeah.
Sorry, I keep trying to save my questions and email you, and then I forget. Because there's so much stuff that goes on in your class. If we keep moving on, I'll forget. But so I'm really intrigued by Jacob. I have such mixed feelings about him, since on the one hand, he's not the kind of guy I think I'd want to hang out with. But at the same time, the fact that, I mean, it's kind of sad that he seems to always be selfishly motivated, even in his relationship with God. What can I get out of this? But I get this feeling, although it's not explicit, that God almost prefers that.
Well, it's interesting because I think what God prefers, I'm speaking literarily, of course. I don't want to presuppose what God prefers, but when we look at the book of Genesis, God always prefers the younger, the second born, the underdog. And that's Jacob. He's the second twin out. He's the one who's, hangs around the tents, and he doesn't fit the stereotype of what the strong Israelite male was supposed to be. And by his wits, he survives, right? That's what sisters do. They don't have the normal power and advantage on their side. So they have to use their wits and other means. In a lot of the literature, women are often tricksters, and we have that in the Bible in a number of places, right? Naomi with Ruth is a trickster. Esther's a trickster. Rahab at Jericho is a trickster, and they survive and thrive because of it. They don't have the normal types of power, so they win by their wits.
But there's also this sense I'm thinking of as
Say that
God seems to like people who engage him instead of just submitting meekly. And I think of Job and how God praises him at the end after he spends all this time getting in God's face.
Yes. It's interesting because you have this strong theme in the Bible of reverence and fear of the Lord. But the tenacious folks who push back, Abraham, who barters with God over Sodom and Gomorrah, Jacob, who's going to wheel and deal throughout, and we're going to see wrestles physically, according to the tradition, wrestles with him. Moses, who, when God says, I'm going to wipe out the whole people and I'm going to start over with you, he says, that's going to make you look really bad. You probably shouldn't do that. Right? Like David.
Yeah.
People who, those are the ones. You're exactly right. Job, right? Job calls God out in ways that feel blasphemous, that the tradition is uncomfortable with. But that doesn't scare off God from people, right? And I think there's a powerful message in that. And that's one where within Judaism, there's a stronger tradition of that than there is in Christianity.
Hmm.
Judaism has this idea of, we can argue and wrestle and say what we need to God. Christians tend to say, easy now.
Yeah, don't ask that question.
Right, right. But to your point, the Bible as a text is a strong tradition of dissent.
Yeah.
We have a right.
I'm sure you know that book, Disappointment with God by Philip Yancey.
Yeah, it's a wonderful book.
Yeah, I remember reading that in college, and my Bible study leader said, well, how could you be disappointed with God?
Yeah.
I was like, let me list the ways.
if people haven't read it, Philip Yancey has this book on theodicy. The problem is God fair, is God just, called Disappointment with God. It's wonderful, and it's a faith-filled book, right? So it's not this, but he pushes back like, hey, it's okay for us to question, to call out, to really be honest. Because in the end, and Job says this to his interlocutors, Job makes the crack at one point. Would you lie in order to defend God? Do you use dishonesty in order to support him? And then he says, in the end, how will he treat you if that's the way you act? And it raises a really interesting question. Are we willing to be fully honest before God about what we feel and how we understand our experience? And again, just like a kid can be honest with a parent, and a parent looks at him and says, I appreciate your honesty. You don't get the bigger picture, or you don't see all the parts. That, and I think sometimes we as God's children probably fit that category. That the honesty should not feel as a threat or as somehow blasphemous or inappropriate.
But that urge to bargain with God, I think, is maybe powerful in all of us. Luther did it, and
Right.
I also think it's so powerful. Like I did it to quit when I was quitting smoking, and that was back when I thought I was an atheist.
That's great, and you were already like bartering with.
Yes, so it's very powerful. It's like, whoa. It worked though.
That's great. Yeah, I mean, think about it. Here's the beauty of these things. You don't know what really works, but one could argue, without Luther bartering with God, we might not have Lutheranism if he really would have gotten hit by the lightning. Now, I don't know if his promise kept him getting hit by the lightning, or if it was just, all in his head. But yeah, Luther could look at it like, hey, it worked.
Yeah, it might be selfish or immature, but God's like, I can work with this.
Yeah, exactly.
That's right.
Thank God for that.
Yeah, right.
But there's also something, you probably see this too, that like when we're doing confirmation and the faith statements, I get really excited when I work with teenagers who are really questioning their faith or wondering, do I even believe in God? And there's a lot of growth that takes place when a teenager really honestly engages those questions.
Right.
And that's really exciting to see.
And that is one of the many reasons I'm glad you're in the role that you're in at Trinity. Thank you.
Thanks.
It's interesting because this is where starting to be old is helpful for me, because I encounter, this is my 25th year at CHCA. And from the time I've begun teaching the way I teach, I've had parents who have been threatened by the kinds of thinking and questioning their students come home with. And I don't like them asking these questions. And now they're reading the Bible differently. And what if they end up, take the logical progression, right? If they're asking this now and then this there, and then where will they end up? And I just had this great moment this past week with two of my former students who graduated in 2000. So we're talking about people in their late 30s who I was walking around giving a tour of the school and introducing them to some students. Like, these were my former students. And they were like, wow, they went here, as if they were ancient, which was really funny. But you see that these are people now of real depth of faith and perspective. Because when I'm 27, 28, I'm saying to parents, like, trust me, this is a good path. This works. They need to work through this to own their faith. Now, having done it for a long time, you see that play out, and you see students who sometimes in their youth are in this mode and persona of the cynic and the doubter. But by wrestling and working through, you see them sometimes come back years and years later and they say, hey, I wasn't really ready at that point, but all those things we were learning and asking in the debates we were having, that was the stuff later on in life that made me understand that this was true and real, and that those actually built my faith, where I didn't see that happening originally. And so now to be able to talk to parents when they have that same fear, to say, I've done it a long time, and I'm just saying that this path works better than just saying, memorize, learn it, and repeat it, and trust us, it's all true. To take that Pauline language of work out your salvation with fear and trembling, I think is powerful. And for those people, Jacob is your, he's your patron patriarch who walks that same path with you. Yeah. Good
Powerful stuff. Yeah.
Good discussion. Well, let's see Jacob get his wife. And there should be a lot of this story which won't surprise you. Then Jacob went on his journey, and he came to the land of the people of the east. As he looked, he saw a well in the field. All right, right now light bulbs are like ding, ding, ding. Uh-oh, he's at the well. He saw a well in the field and the 3 flocks of sheep lying there beside it. For out of that well, the flocks were watered. The stone on the well's mouth was large, and when all the flocks were gathered there, the shepherds would roll the stone from the mouth of the well and water the sheep, and put the stone back in its place on the mouth of the well. Jacob said to them, "My brothers, where do you come from?" They said, "We are from Haran." He said to them, "Do you know Laban, son of Nahor?" They said, "We do." He said to them, "Is it well with him?" "Yes," they replied. "And here is his daughter, Rachel, coming with the sheep." He said, "Look, it is still broad daylight. It is not time for the animals to be gathered together. Water the sheep and go pasture them." But they said, "We cannot until all the flocks are gathered together and the stone is rolled from the mouth of the well. Then we water the sheep." While he was still speaking to them, Rachel came with her father's sheep, for she kept them. Now, when Jacob saw Rachel, the daughter of his mother's brother Laban, and the sheep of his mother's brother Laban, Jacob went up and rolled the stone from the well's mouth and watered the flock of his mother's brother Laban. Then Jacob kissed Rachel and wept aloud. When Jacob told Rachel that he was her father's kinsman and that he was Rebekah's son, and she ran and told her father. Now imagine this. He's on this long journey. He's starting to get near the area where he knows his family's from. But again, there's no GPS. There's no maps. There's no cell phones. There's no communication. He's wandering in an unknown place in a certain direction, probably going by landmarks they told him, right? When you come to this, veer off. When he comes there, he sees a well. He comes up to it, and all of a sudden, here comes a person, and this is the exact person from his family that he was supposed to find. So he's overwhelmed. He kisses her. He says, "Hey, go tell the relatives I'm here." When Laban heard the news about his sister's son Jacob, he ran to meet him. He embraced him and kissed him and brought him to his house. Jacob told Laban all these things, and Laban said to him, "Surely," again, all the way back to Genesis, "you are my bone and my flesh." And he stayed with him a month. Now remember, bone and flesh go back to the man and woman story, which becomes the precursor to marriage. Remember, he tries making all different kinds of creatures that would be a nice match, but in the end, out of the rib, bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh, so the two become one. So Laban says this of him, like, look, we're supposed to go together. All right, now trickster story at its best. Here it goes. Then Laban said to Jacob, because you are my kinsman, should you therefore serve me for nothing? Tell me, what shall your wages be? Now Laban had 2 daughters. The name of the elder was Leah, and the name of the younger was Rachel. Now, here's the first problematic Hebrew phrase, which we'll talk about. This translates, Leah's eyes were lovely, and Rachel was graceful and beautiful. Okay, now, most of you probably grew up with translations that did not have Leah's eyes as lovely. And the Hebrew word there is not lovely. The word can mean weak or soft. And traditionally, in one other thing, just not to go all translation on you, Hebrew does not have a word for and. It has a word that's a conjunction, and you make it any conjunction you need. So if you look at verse 17, traditionally, people looked at the idea that her eye was weak or her eyes were weak as some kind of a physical disability or physical flaw. And then the conjunction is read as, now Leah's eyes were weak, but Rachel was graceful and beautiful. Okay? But if you read her eyes as soft instead of weak, some said, well, maybe it's talking about gentleness. She has these gentle eyes. The rabbis read this and they say her eyes were soft, meaning she was always teary because she was so prayerful and, always seeking God. Some modern interpreters have read this tearful as she's a wounded soul, and that's just going to continue on when we see that she's not loved. We don't know for sure what it means, but the fact that Jacob loves Rachel rather than Leah, who's the elder, has traditionally made people read the eyes comment as somehow negative. Bottom line is it doesn't really matter, but he decides he wants Rachel. So it says, Jacob loved Rachel. So he said, I will serve you 7 years for your younger daughter, Rachel. Laban said, it is better that I give her to you than I should give her to any other man. Stay with me. So Jacob served 7 years for Rachel, and they seemed to him but a few days because of the love he had for her. Okay, this is this great, he's pining after her. And, those 7 years just flew by because when you're working for love, what's 7 years? So he works 7 years, and then the time comes. Then Jacob said to Laban, give me my wife that I may, and I can't believe this translation of the NRSV. Give me my wife so that I may go into her, for my time is completed. That's what it literally says. If I was translating this with my students, I would say, please don't be so crass. And we'd translate something more like, so that I may be with her, for my time is completed. So Laban gathered together all the people of the place and made a feast. But in the evening, he took his daughter Leah and brought her to Jacob, and he was with her instead. Now, again, economy of language in biblical narrative. We don't get all the backstory. We don't get all the filler, so we have to use our imagination. But in ancient Near Eastern weddings, these are big, long banquet feasts with much eating and even more drinking. I tend to think that there was enough alcohol involved that when he actually did the switcheroo on the brides, Jacob doesn't really know what just happened to him. So the whole festivities go on, And again, we read these things in the ancient world, like, right, they're brought into the marriage tent. There's all this stuff. There's the, right, in they go. And verse 24, Laban gave his maid Zilpah to his daughter Leah to be her maid. That'll be important later. When morning came, it was Leah. So you think about this, the tricksters get duped, and two of the ways they're most often tricked, eating, sexuality. I don't think you can be tricked sexually any more than waking up on your honeymoon with the wrong woman. All right? And he says, what is this you've done to me? Did I not serve with you for Rachel? Why then have you deceived me? And then Laban gives him a very Jacob-esque line. This is not done in our country, giving the younger before the firstborn. Complete the week of this one, right? Like this conjugal honeymoon period, and we will give you the other also in return for serving me another 7 years. All right, so here's the beauty. And this is why I prefer the reading of there's something physically inferior about Leah, is that Laban has the older daughter who's supposed to be wed first, but he's in a difficult situation of not being able to find a suitor. So what he does is he not only gets her married, he gets another free 7 years of labor out of Jacob. All right, the trickster gets duped, 14 years for two daughters, one of whom he wasn't even really all that interested in. All right. So Jacob did so and completed her week. Then Laban gave him his daughter Rachel as his wife. Laban gave his maid Bilhah to his daughter Rachel to be her maid. So Jacob was with Rachel also, and he loved Rachel more than Leah. He served Laban for another 7 years. All right, so by the end of this chapter, Laban has married off both his daughters, and he's gained 14 years of hard labor out of a son-in-law. Jacob ends up with two wives, one of whom he loves. He loves more than Leah. He spends these 14 years working for Laban. And in the midst, this next chapter is really interesting. And I want to set it up in a way, and we'll read through this because a lot of it is like, when I'm dealing with the students, I talk about this as the great baby race. Because what we have here is really sad, really. I mean, it can be seen as like funny on a really surface level, but if you actually get to the human tragedy of it, it's a sad story. So you have a husband who loves one of his two wives more. And the interesting thing about this, and you know, this is one of those times when reading a good feminist scholar was helpful for me in all my patriarchal masculine reading of texts. She points out many of us make in our heads this great love story here where Jacob and Rachel, right, are like deeply in love, and Leah just gets thrown in as the package deal. And this rabbinic scholar points out, actually, it doesn't say anywhere in the text that Rachel loves her husband. She said, it's just the male fantasy that any woman you love, you assume she must love you back. But it tells us a couple of times that Jacob loves Rachel, but we never hear that Rachel loves Jacob. Instead, like our evidence in our head was, no, but she keeps trying to have children for him. To which this scholar replies, that's sister rivalry. That's got nothing to do with Jacob. And in these next series of this next story, here's where, again, we have to think in an ancient Near Eastern context and in the context of tricksters. Jacob, in his producing of all of these children, it does not put Jacob in a positive light. Jacob becomes like the stud animal who's being used by his wives in a baby making contest. It's the race for who can produce more children and more significant children. And Jacob is getting played back and forth between them. Okay, again, think of this trickster idea. They get duped, and it's both gastronomical and sexual. Let me read you through this chapter, which is just baby after baby after baby. When Rachel saw, just wait, did I go right here? Yeah, all right. When Rachel saw that she bore Jacob no children, she envied her sister, and she said to Jacob, give me children, or I shall die. Jacob became very angry with Rachel and said, am I in the place of God? Just wait, we skipped something here. Let me go back. Yeah, I missed the end of it, sorry. Let's end 29. When the Lord saw that Leah was unloved, he opened her womb, but Rachel was barren. Again, our barrenness theme. Leah conceived and bore a son. She named him Reuben, for she said, because the Lord has looked on my affliction. Surely now my husband will love me. All of these names are going to be word plays. And the word plays all have to do with this contest of winning a husband's affection and outdoing your sister. So first son, Reuben. She conceived again and bore a son and said, because the Lord has heard that I am hated, he has given me this son also. And she named him Simeon. Again she conceived and bore a son and said, now this time my husband will be joined to me, because I have borne him 3 sons. Therefore he was named Levi. She conceived again and bore a son and said, this time I will praise the Lord. Therefore she named him Judah. Then she ceased bearing. All right, so she, right off the bat, she knocks out 4 sons. Like, what more could you do? But in each name, she's thinking, now my husband will truly love me. When Rachel saw that she bore Jacob no children, she envied her sister, and she said to Jacob, give me children or I shall die, right? This isn't because I love you so much. Her sister's outdoing her. Jacob became very angry with Rachel and said, am I in the place of God who has withheld from you the fruit of the womb? Then she said, here is my maid, Bilhah. Be with her, that she may bear upon my knees, and that I too may have children through her. Remember, we talked about this with Sarah and Hagar, this idea that the concubine bears on your behalf. So here is Rachel going, I can't physically bear, but my concubine will on my behalf. So she gave him her maid Bilhah as wife, and Jacob was with her, and Bilhah conceived and bore Jacob a son. Then Rachel said, God has judged me and has also heard my voice and given me a son. Therefore she named him Dan. Rachel's maid Bilhah conceived again and bore Jacob a second son. Then Rachel said, with mighty wrestlings I have wrestled with my sister and have prevailed, which is interesting. Remember this name about wrestling and prevailing. So she named him Naphtali. It's got nothing to do with Jacob. It's sisters. When Leah saw that she had ceased bearing children, she took her maid Zilpah and gave her to Jacob as a wife. Then Leah's maid Zilpah bore Jacob a son, and Leah said, good fortune, so she named him Gad. Leah's maid Zilpah bore Jacob a second son. Leah said, Happy am I, for women shall call me happy. So she named him Asher. All right, so again, now this is context of readers, audiences, and how we understand it in cultural settings. So when you're reading this 21st century with adolescent boys, they're like, wow, Jacob's the man, right? He's got all these women and are throwing women at him. And I'm like, no, you don't get it. He's being played for the fool. He is the stud animal. He has no control in this. And the irony in this is the name Leah in Hebrew means cow, and Rachel means like you or female lamb. They're like, they have animal names, and he is the stud animal getting passed back and forth. And it gets even better. In the days of the wheat harvest, Reuben went and found mandrakes in the field and brought them to his mother Leah. Now, mandrakes are a kind of plant that, if you can picture their roots, think if you can picture raw ginger, right? Like this kind of a tuber with these big, and mandrakes, almost like, if you could think of the roots, almost look like people, right? Like being dug up from the ground. So these were considered to be like this aphrodisiac that would help fertility. So he finds them in the field, brings them to his mother. And then Rachel says to Leah, please give me some of your son's mandrakes. But she said to her, is it a small matter that you've taken away my husband? Would you take away my son's mandrakes also? Rachel said, then he may lie with you tonight for your son's mandrakes. I mean, they're like pimping this guy out back and forth, wheeling and dealing. When Jacob came from the field in the evening, Leah went out to meet him and said, you must come in to me, for I have hired you with my son's mandrakes. So he lay with her that night, and God heeded Leah, and she conceived and bore Jacob a fifth son. Leah said, God has given me my hire, because I gave my maid to my husband. So she named him Issachar. And Leah conceived again, and she bore Jacob a sixth son. Then Leah said, God has endowed me with a good dowry. Now my husband will honor me, because I have borne him 6 sons. So she named him Zebulun. Afterward, she bore a daughter and named her Dinah. Then God remembered Rachel, and God heeded her and opened her womb. She conceived and bore a son and said, God has taken away my reproach, and she named him Joseph, saying, may the Lord add to me another son. Okay, now let's jump ahead. We all know the story of Joseph, and Joseph is the most loved of his father, and he's like the spoiled little brat. Why? Because of these 2 wives and their concubines and all this baby making contest, his favorite wife, his beloved wife, who can never actually conceive, finally does, and it's Joseph. Do you see how this story is already built for this little punk to get hated? Then he's going to start talking about he's dreaming about everyone bows down to him. Like, he's set up to be a problem. And then he's going to make it even worse. So anyway, we've covered a lot of ground. And this next one, it gets really interesting. And the trickster story is just building. But today, our trickster we see as the tricked, the duped one, the played one. But again, even in his being duped, if you don't know where this is headed, all of these children are going to come are tribes of Israel. These are important, even in this kind of crass, bawdy, funny trickster story about the trickster getting played like a farm animal, sent out to stud. He is creating the tribes of the people of Israel. The Bible is not that clean of a story. It's not as neat and tidy as religious folks might want it to be. But that's what makes this stuff great. Because again, I don't think our lives fit in good religious tidy stories most of the time. But even in this, even in the wheeling and dealing, even in the tricking, even in the baby making contest, even the hiring out your husband between women, God is somehow at work bringing about his purposes so that this man will be a great name, a great nation, and all the world will be blessed through him. Good stuff. Comments, questions, thoughts. I know I've run a little bit long. So, but I want to make sure we have time if anybody's got any questions. Otherwise, if they come to you throughout the week, hold on to them. We'll start with them next week. All right, let me pray for us, folks. God, I thank you for your goodness and for your faithfulness to us. I thank you for your word. And I thank you for the story of Jacob and how in this person, with his flaws, his shortcomings, what looks like lack of faith and lack of humility, in his foolishness and his conniving, you are still at work. God, give us the assurance that despite all of our flaws and shortcomings, and of those that we might not have patience for, to know that you can still work through us and them as well. God, be with us in this Advent season as we wait. We wait for Christmas and we wait for your ultimate coming, as we wait for all things to be made new, as we wait for the kingdoms of this world to become the kingdom of our God and of his Christ, who shall reign forever and ever. God, we thank you and we bless you and we pray this all in Christ's name. Amen. All right, everyone. Have a great week. We're getting close to Christmas, so may this be a great week for you, and look forward to all meeting next week.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Dean.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.